Iran believed the worst was behind it. Kharg Island had taken a devastating hit. American strikes had systematically dismantled every military installation on the island, leaving its defense infrastructure in ruins. But the oil terminals were still standing, the pipelines were still flowing, and as long as that remained true, revenue would keep coming in, enough to sustain a regime that had few other lifelines left. That calculation, however, is about to change dramatically. Washington is now moving something significant toward Kharg Island, something that suggests the United States may be preparing for the most consequential ground operation against Iran in a generation. And if that operation unfolds as current deployments suggest it might, the consequences for the Iranian regime could be catastrophic. To understand what is coming, it helps to first understand what is happening on the island right now. Kharg is still absorbing the damage from the earlier wave of American strikes that, according to President Donald Trump himself, completely eliminated every military target on the island. Since then, the situation on the ground has remained largely unchanged. Oil operations are continuing, exports are still moving. On the surface, it might appear that Iran has stabilized its position there. But Iran's concern is not about what is happening today, it is about what is coming tomorrow. Because the United States is sending the USS Boxer, along with the rest of its amphibious ready group, steaming toward the Middle East from its home port on the West Coast. And it is not coming alone. Traveling with the USS Boxer is the 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, a force of approximately 2,500 Marines who could be ordered to put boots on the ground at a moment's notice. Supporting the group are two additional amphibious warships, the San Antonio-class USS Portland and the Whidbey Island-class USS Comstock, along with air and ground components capable of supporting a full-scale landing operation. Under normal circumstances, this deployment alone would represent significant and alarming news for Tehran. But this is not a normal circumstance, because the 11th MEU is not the first Marine force the United States has ordered into the Persian Gulf region.
In mid-March, reports confirmed that the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit was already being redeployed to the Middle East from its forward base in Okinawa, Japan. With it came additional amphibious assault vessels and a contingent of roughly 2,000 Marines. Those forces are expected to arrive in Iranian waters around the end of March. The 11th MEU is expected to follow in the weeks after, potentially linking up with the 31st to create a combined force of more than 4,000 Marines, supported by the air power and amphibious platforms necessary to execute a landing on Kharg Island. That is at least one of the scenarios now being seriously discussed. According to the War Zone, what is unfolding is an accelerated force deployment being directed toward Iran in direct support of Operation Epic Fury. Kharg Island appears to be the focal point, and a growing number of additional indicators suggests that the United States is methodically building toward a significant action targeting the small island that sits at the very center of Iran's economic survival. Among those indicators is the deployment of the U.S. Navy's MQ-4C Triton unmanned aerial vehicle to the Persian Gulf and Kharg Island areas. The Triton is not a strike platform. Its purpose is reconnaissance, persistent, high-altitude surveillance of targets and areas of interest. On March 20th, one of America's Triton drones was observed flying repeated orbits directly over the largest oil terminal on Kharg Island, suggesting that American intelligence is keeping extremely close watch on Iranian activity there. Additional deployments include Apache attack helicopters and A-10 Warthog ground attack aircraft being sent to the Strait of Hormuz. Both platforms serve obvious purposes in the strait. They are well suited for engaging Iranian fast boats, Shahed drones, and coastal missile sites along the shoreline.
But there is another layer of significance to those aircraft that cannot be overlooked. Both the Apache and the A-10 were central to American operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. In both of those conflicts, they performed a specific and critical function, preparing the battlefield ahead of ground troop arrivals by suppressing fortified positions, destroying hardened targets, and providing direct fire support to advancing forces. They were among the very first aircraft deployed in both wars. And the first ground forces sent into Afghanistan? U.S. Marines from Marine Expeditionary Units. The echoes of that pattern are difficult to ignore.
Before examining what the United States may be planning, it is worth stepping back to understand precisely why Kharg Island matters so much, because its strategic value extends far beyond the military infrastructure that American strikes have already destroyed. Kharg Island is small. It measures only about 5 miles from end to end, but its role in the Iranian economy is enormous and almost entirely irreplaceable. Nearly all of Iran's oil exports pass through Kharg Island. The terminals and pipeline infrastructure located there process Iranian crude and refined petroleum products before loading them onto tankers bound for buyer nations around the world. According to CBS News, Kharg Island historically handles somewhere between 85% and 95% of all Iranian crude oil exports. Iran holds approximately 10% of the world's proven oil reserves. Oil revenue is the primary financial engine of the Iranian state. The most recent available figures from 2024 indicate that Iran's total oil revenue that year exceeded $46 billion. If up to 95% of those exports move through Kharg Island, losing control of that territory would carve a roughly $43.7 billion hole directly into Iran's annual budget, at a moment when the regime can least afford to absorb that kind of blow. That economic reality creates a powerful and obvious strategic incentive for the United States. Seizing Kharg Island would not merely damage Iran militarily, it would threaten the financial foundation holding the regime together. The strategic logic runs even deeper when viewed alongside the broader context of Operation Epic Fury. Iran's primary source of leverage in this confrontation is its ability to disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply, along with approximately 20% of all globally traded liquefied natural gas, passes through that narrow waterway. By deploying drones and fast attack boats against merchant vessels, Iran has created exactly the kind of global economic shock it calculated would place unbearable pressure on Washington. Oil prices have surged well above $100 per barrel as tanker captains have grown increasingly reluctant to risk their vessels in Iranian targeted waters. The arithmetic of a Kharg Island operation is therefore straightforward. U.S. Marines plus control of Kharg Island equals a powerful and immediate counter-leverage tool, one that allows Washington to respond to Iranian pressure in the Strait by threatening to permanently eliminate the billions of dollars in oil revenue that keep the regime functional. Former U.S. Central Command Commander General Joseph Votel framed the dual message that a ground operation would send in a March 20th interview. It carries an informational and messaging advantage against the Iranians that American forces are operating on their territory, and it signals to the broader international energy community that the United States is actively working to protect those vital infrastructure assets. Boots on the ground on Kharg Island would tell Tehran that Washington is prepared to go further than anyone previously anticipated. It would simultaneously reassure energy-dependent nations that America is taking direct action to resolve the Strait of Hormuz crisis.
There are, however, three distinct approaches that the incoming Marine expeditionary units could support, each carrying different risks, different benefits, and very different consequences. The first and most discussed option is a direct ground assault and occupation of Kharg Island. The numbers currently being assembled appear sufficient for such an operation. General Votel has estimated that somewhere between 800 and 1,000 Marines would likely be required to clear whatever remains of Iranian defensive forces from the island. The Sunday Times has suggested that even the approximately 2,200 Marines traveling with the 31st MEU alone may not be enough, with the exact requirement depending heavily on how many Iranian personnel survived the earlier American strikes. A larger force would almost certainly be needed to hold the island and establish a secure defensive perimeter around its oil infrastructure, which may explain precisely why a second MEU is currently underway toward the region. The Marines being deployed are trained specifically for this type of amphibious assault operation. They are supported by current intelligence, dedicated air power that has already been shaping the operational environment, and an array of artillery, armored vehicles, helicopters, and F-35B vertical takeoff fighter jets arriving alongside their amphibious vessels. Taking Kharg Island from whatever fractured Iranian forces remain there would likely not present an overwhelming military challenge, particularly if additional American airstrikes are conducted ahead of the Marines' arrival to further degrade any remaining defensive capability. Holding it, however, is a different question entirely. Kharg Island sits only about 20 miles from the Iranian coastline. U.S. Marines and equipment positioned there would immediately become stationary targets within easy range of Iranian coastal missile launches. While Iran's overall missile capability has been significantly degraded by Operation Epic Fury, the country has demonstrated that it retains the ability to strike fixed targets. Any American resupply operations to the island would have to navigate the threat posed by Iranian drones and fast boats operating in the surrounding waters. And while the A-10s and Apaches already operating in the strait could serve as capable escorts for supply convoys, Iranian missile sites that have not yet been identified and neutralized would remain an ongoing risk until they choose to fire and expose themselves. There is, however, one factor that complicates Iranian decision-making on this front considerably. Striking American Marines on Kharg Island with missiles or rockets risks damaging the very oil infrastructure that Iran depends upon for its economic survival. Whether Tehran would view that trade-off as acceptable, particularly after American occupation has already stripped away the revenue those facilities generate, is a question that only a ground operation would ultimately answer. The second option is a naval blockade of Kharg Island, using the incoming amphibious ready groups to prevent merchant vessels from accessing the island's oil terminals and loading facilities. This approach would give Iran a direct and pointed experience of its own tactics. Rather than attacking civilian vessels, as Iranian forces have done in the strait, American warships would simply position themselves to prevent commercial tankers from completing their loading operations at Kharg. No merchant ships would be harmed, but Iranian oil exports would halt just as effectively as if the terminals had been destroyed. The appeal of this option is that it avoids both the political complexity and the military risk of putting American ground forces directly onto Iranian soil. Washington could characterize the blockade as a measured, proportional response, avoiding escalation while still applying maximum economic pressure on Tehran. The significant challenge, however, is that a naval blockade requires warships to maintain sustained positions in waters well within range of Iran's coastal missile batteries. Unlike the fast, unpredictable strike and withdraw tactics Iranian forces employ in the strait, American vessels enforcing a blockade would need to hold relatively fixed stations, making them far more predictable targets for Iranian anti-ship missiles and drone attacks. Protecting those ships would likely require the kind of sustained air suppression campaign against Iranian coastal launch sites that the A-10s and Apache helicopters already in the region are well positioned to support. The third option requires no marine landing at all. The United States could simply destroy what remains of Kharg Island's oil export infrastructure from the air, eliminating the terminals and pipelines that have so far been deliberately spared, and permanently removing Iran's ability to generate oil revenue for years to come. According to CNBC, destroying that infrastructure would cost Iran approximately 1.5 million barrels per day in crude exports, the volume that currently sustains the regime's cash flow. Rebuilding what American air power destroyed would take years under the best of circumstances, assuming Iran could find the resources and the access to do so at all. This option carries real strategic risks that complicate the calculation significantly, however. China purchases approximately 80% of Iranian oil exports. Destroying Kharg Island's export infrastructure would directly harm Chinese energy interests at a moment when U.S.-China tensions are already elevated to a dangerous degree. The diplomatic fallout from such a move could extend well beyond the Iran crisis itself. There is also the near-certain Iranian response to consider. Facing the permanent destruction of its primary revenue source, Tehran would almost certainly escalate its attacks against the energy infrastructure of its Gulf neighbors, potentially triggering a far wider regional crisis than the one Operation Epic Fury set out to resolve. And there is one additional factor that makes this option strategically unattractive for Washington. Intact Kharg Island infrastructure represents a potential bargaining chip, a prize that the United States could theoretically leverage to negotiate an agreement in which America benefits from Iranian oil exports going forward. That card disappears entirely the moment the bombs start falling on those terminals. The most likely scenario, based on current deployments and available indicators, appears to be that Washington is seriously considering either a blockade or a ground occupation, and possibly a combination of both, with the two incoming MEUs providing the essential force necessary to execute either approach. What remains genuinely unclear is whether the order to act has actually been given. President Trump's public messaging on the subject has been deliberately contradictory. On March 20th, he stated unequivocally that there would be no ceasefire with Iran, declaring that a ceasefire makes no sense when one side is, in his words, being obliterated. One day later, he appeared to signal that he was looking to wind down Operation Epic Fury entirely, a position that would seem to be directly contradicted by deploying additional thousands of Marines toward the conflict zone. On March 23rd, reports emerged that American and Iranian officials had engaged in preliminary talks aimed at a complete resolution of hostilities. Trump indicated he would hold back on threatened strikes against Iranian power infrastructure for 5 days in response to those discussions. Iranian officials immediately denied that any such talks had taken place, with Iran's parliament speaker characterizing the reports as fabricated and designed to manipulate oil markets. The only certainty in this environment is that roughly 2,500 additional U.S. Marines are currently en route toward Iran, and that Kharg Island appears to be squarely within their operational planning horizon. If the United States ultimately pulls the trigger, whether through blockade, occupation, or some combination of both, Iran will be staring directly at a multi-billion-dollar annual revenue loss that could accelerate the collapse of a regime already operating under extraordinary pressure. Washington may be moving to cut off the last financial artery keeping the Iranian government alive. Kharg Island has already been struck once. The question now is whether the next blow will be the one that finally decides the outcome. The pieces are all moving into place. The Marines are on their way. The surveillance drones are already circling. The attack aircraft are already positioned. And the detailed ground operation plans are already sitting on Pentagon desks waiting for a signature. Iran is running out of time and running out of options. Because here is the reality that Tehran cannot escape. Every scenario the United States is currently considering ends the same way for the Iranian regime. A blockade stops the oil money. An occupation stops the oil money. And the destruction of Kharg Island's infrastructure stops the oil money permanently. The only variable is how much additional military humiliation accompanies that financial devastation. For decades, Iran's leadership has used oil revenue as the backbone of its survival, funding its military, subsidizing its population, and projecting power across the Middle East through proxy forces and strategic pressure. Strip away that revenue, and the entire architecture of the regime begins to crack. That is not speculation, that is arithmetic. And Washington knows it. Whether Trump ultimately gives the order to land Marines on Kharg, enforces a naval blockade, or finds a negotiated exit before either option becomes necessary, the leverage the United States now holds over Iran is unlike anything the regime has faced before. 2 MEUs, thousands of Marines, air power already shaping the battlefield, and a $43 billion pressure point sitting on a 5-mile island in the Persian Gulf. Iran thought surviving the first round of strikes meant it had bought itself time. It may have bought itself nothing more than a front-row seat to the next phase of Operation Epic Fury. This is Shadow Politics. We will keep following this story as it develops. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.